Hello, and welcome to the second in a series of conversations about civil war. What the conditions are for civil war, and how likely they are to occur in a country like the United States. As you remember from the introduction, I am relying to some extent on research by experts in the field, several important books that have been written, and my own research. Today, I'm going to talk about the conditions for civil war in general, not necessarily in the United States, not necessarily in developed countries, but just civil wars that have occurred around the world in the last 30 or 40 years. There's been some terrific research by Barbara F. Walter, who's written a book about this, on how civil wars start. And I'm relying to some extent, to a great extent, in fact, on what she has discovered in her research and reported on. So I think that the best place to start is to examine some of the myths that we have about civil wars. For Americans, our point of reference is the American Civil War between the states in the 19th century. And as you know, that was a war between two armies and states. So the southern states, with their secession, formed the Confederacy and fought against the United States government. So it was two governments fighting each other, one secessionist and one existing, and two armies in what was the first industrial war. Civil wars today don't generally take this form. More often, they begin with populist uprisings or terrorist activities or the collapse of an authoritarian government. So we have to look at a different situation. We're living in a post-industrial environment. Technology, communications are much different than they were in the 19th century. So we need to put aside the idea of two armies fighting each other, as was true in our history. Another myth about civil wars is that they occur primarily when you have an oppressive or authoritarian regime. And we can think of various examples there. Libya, Romania, populist uprisings that overthrew a dictator. But in fact, the more common scenarios for civil wars is when you have neither a strong authoritarian dictatorship or a strong, fairly functioning democracy. Usually this occurs is when you have a weakened government, either weakened authoritarian or weakened democratic government, where the institutions of democracy are not working well, or the institutions of the dictatorship and authoritarian regime are not working well to serve the people's interests. The other myth that you have is that civil wars are started or engendered by the conditions of the oppressed groups in society, whether it be the poor people, or minorities, ethnic groups, people who are downtrodden, in other words, rise up. And that's the popular myth. In fact, conditions for civil wars occur in a much different way. Generally, they are initiated by a privileged group, someone who has a group that has enjoyed certain privileges, either economically or in terms of the society, and their privileges have been slowly eroded. So it's more about the powerful or the privileged losing power and fighting to maintain that hold, which causes civil disruption, chaos, and often civil war that can topple governments. So let's look at, those are some of the myths around civil wars that we need to dispel and to take a different perspective, a different paradigm for civil wars. One of the most important preconditions for civil war is the weakening of the government. And as I said before, It could be an authoritarian government. I use an example, for example, Romania or Libya, where you had an authoritarian government that was slowly weakened, and usually you could see cracks in the governmental structure or the regime in the military or the other elites. And this was an opportunity for what looks like a populist revolt. Generally, it's something that's a combination of the loss of confidence from the elites or the military and popular discontent with the regime. But the key is that the government is not functioning well, and people lose their trust in the government. So even if they are not actively anti-government, they distrust the government or believe that it can no longer serve their needs or even keep them safe. And this can also happen in a democracy. We have some pure democracies in the world, or at least democracies that if you went on a scale of 1 to 10, they would be a 10. And those are places like New Zealand, Canada, Sweden, are truly democratic governments. The United States has often been in that category or up near the top, 8 or 9. I would say in the last 6 to 8 years with the Trump administration, they slipped down into the 5s. And this is not my scoring. This is the scoring of researchers who study democratic governments. I think since the defeat of Trump, some of the more authoritarian strains in government have diminished, and the United States is back in the category not of a full democracy, but in the democratic area, let's say a 7. However, the difficulty is with any government, and I'm talking about authoritarian, democratic, developed, underdeveloped, any society, if the government is weak, this provides a real fertile ground for civil chaos, because either the population partly hates the government, doesn't trust the government, or even if they support the government, they don't feel that the government is able to protect them. So this means there's a great deal of uncertainty, fear, and doubt and distrust. And this can lead to, obviously, to civil disturbances and ultimately civil war. One of the other things that happens in a civil war scenario is that the politics of the country, whether they're authoritarian or whether they're parliamentary or whether they're Republican as ours are, is that the political parties become factionalized. So you can see this in many parliamentary democracies where you may have dozens, literally, of political parties, and some representing orthodox religious views, or some representing socialist or more moderate or religious views, Christian nationalists, social democrats. If they become so factionalized, obviously this leads to stalemate in the government. It can often do that. And also people are divided into different factional camps. So there's a lack of unity in the government. And that leads to a weakened government, as we were talking about before. So you see political factionalization as one of the factors that leads to civil war. And you can see the beginning of this in the United States, where Democrats and Republicans are factionalized into those two camps. But then within the parties, you also have, in the Democrats, the progressives and moderates, and in the Republicans, you have the MAGA and the moderate Republicans. So that's one area of factionalization. The other area is when political parties or the politics or the society in general divides up into ethnic, religious, or nationalistic groups. And this is a particularly dangerous scenario because if you have somebody who is hyper-nationalist, for example, or hyper-religious, they're less willing to compromise or have an allegiance to the institutions of the country. So, for example, you might have in Germany, for example, you might have ultranationalists who believe in a German ideal, an ideal of Germany that's been betrayed by the mainstream parties, and they're not going to be in any mood to compromise what they believe are the highest ideals of the German people. And you see, obviously, this occurring in the United States as well. Of course, the other thing is the ethnic divisions, or ethnic or racial divisions, and we see this in many countries. In Europe, you have the native-born, shall we say, Europeans versus the immigrants, and you see in the United States the same issue between native-born and immigrant populations, and you also see racial breakdowns. Obviously, different ethnic or racial groups can separate out, whites versus blacks, or immigrants versus natives. So Muslims versus Christians, all these factions. If this enters into politics, that is also another precursor to civil war, because obviously these are views, positions, ideologies that really are not compatible with a unified society or a unified government. Another thing that happens is that, and I talked about the privileged group, who often are the ones who initiate civil unrest. And by privileged, I mean people who, by virtue of their birth, essentially, have status. If you are a native-born Frenchman, you have a certain status when it's compared to an immigrant from Algeria or an immigrant from Africa. However, if the government is working, or if it seems to you that you're losing your privileged status to these newcomers, then you're going to fight back. You're going to preserve that privilege that you believe you had. Obviously, this is true in the United States, where you have white men specifically, and often Christian white men, who feel that they've been deprived of a privileged status in relation to women, in relation to minorities. This is also true of some of often working class folks, people in the rural, non-urban areas, always have felt that somehow that their status has been undermined. And human beings hate to lose. And when you feel like you're losing something, even if it's an intangible thing like your status, forget about the economic side of it, which may or may not be relevant. If you're losing that status, then you're going to fight to regain it. It's something, loss is just something that we fight desperately against. It's way our brains and our psychology is wired. And, you see this in many different areas. You can see it in folks, as I said, who are traditionalists, which tends to be folks who are sons of the soil, people who grew up, lived in the same town and have traditional values. It can be true of working class folks. It can be true of men to some degree. So these are all groups that feel they're losing their status, and they're going to fight to regain it. I would say the final point would be that the aspect of hope is very important. If I am part of a class of people in any society who feel like I am losing something precious to me, which is my status, my privileged status, my identity, my religious beliefs, whatever it may be. If I feel like I'm losing those things, I'm going to fight to get them back. So there'll be a period where I'll be fighting very hard. I'll be fighting in elections, and if I lose elections, I may give that up, and I might try some other ways outside of the electoral system. to regain my status. But there's a point where at which you see the handwriting on the wall and you feel that you have nothing more to gain by fighting, and you essentially lose hope. And when you lose hope, it means that anything is possible. If your life looks hopeless, then fighting to the death for a lost cause may be what you see as your only alternative. This is very true of many countries. We saw this in Ireland and other places where people did their best to try to hold on to things that were valued to them, but they realized that the cards were stacked against them. And so they were willing to take up arms or do whatever else was necessary because they had no more hope in the future. These are people who are essentially desperate. And even if it's a small group of people, they can cause a lot of trouble, and they can also take the initiative when you have a populace that's essentially paralyzed or a government that's essentially weakened and paralyzed. So these are some of the preconditions that you'll find around the world in different societies for a civil war. I'm going to close this today, and thank you for your attention. The next series, we're going to talk about the United States and some of the preconditions that exist. And we'll be looking at the question of whether there's a cold civil war going on already in the United States, and what are the chances for it, or the likelihood that it will continue and accelerate into what would be the modern version of a full civil war. So thank you, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.